I was 5 years old when I saw her for the first time. My memories of that night are sharp, as if etched into my mind with a knife, though I often wish I could forget. We lived in a cramped one-room apartment in a small, quiet town, just the three of us, Mom, Dad, and me. It was an ordinary family in an ordinary town. But what happened that night was anything but ordinary. It started like any other night. I had gone to bed after Mom read me a story, and Dad had tucked me in with a goodnight kiss. I was always a bit restless, and getting up for a drink of water in the middle of the night was a regular occurrence. I wasn't like other kids who were afraid of the dark or imagined monsters lurking under the bed. I was brave, or so I thought. But that night, something changed. I remember padding softly across the cold floor, heading to the bathroom. The apartment was silent, the kind of deep, heavy silence that makes you feel as though you're the only one awake in the world. After drinking my water, I turned to go back to bed, still half asleep. But as I closed the bathroom door, I froze. There, in the doorway leading into the kitchen, stood a woman. She wasn't my mother. This woman was wrong. Her clothes were strange, like something out of an old storybook, tattered and dirty, hanging loosely off her thin frame. Her hair was wild, a tangled mess that seemed to move on its own. And her eyes, they were wide and dark, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. In the dim light of the apartment, she looked like a shadow that had come to life. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. I just stood there, locked in place, as she took a step toward me. It was a small step, but enough to break me out of my trance. My body acted before my mind could process what was happening. I turned and ran, sprinting back to my bed and diving under the covers, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would wake my parents. I lay there, shivering, clutching my blanket like a shield, but I could still feel her gaze, heavy, piercing, as if she were just outside the door, watching, waiting. Somehow, I fell asleep, though I don't remember how. In the morning, the fear had faded, replaced by confusion. I told my mom about the witch I saw in the apartment, but she just laughed and said I must have had a bad dream. Even at that young age, I felt she was wrong. It hadn't been a dream. I was sure of it. I saw her. But as the days passed, I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just my imagination. Kids see things all the time, right? But deep down, I knew she was real. And sometimes, when I was alone, I'd feel that same chill in the air, as if she was watching me. I would glance toward the kitchen doorway, half expecting to see her standing there, waiting. But the years passed, and the memory faded, until recently. Fast forward 11 years. I'm 16 now, and though that memory of the strange woman has lingered in the back of my mind, I've mostly written it off as a childhood nightmare. Life moved on, and so did we. My family and I left that small town and moved to a larger city. We now live in a more spacious apartment, where I finally have my own room. I told myself I was done with the memories of that night, that it was just my imagination. But lately, strange things have been happening again. It started subtly, in ways that were easy to brush off. Small objects around the apartment would go missing, and then reappear in the oddest places. The book I'd left on my nightstand would be found on the kitchen counter the next morning. The TV remote, which I was sure I left on the couch, would end up on my desk. My parents thought it was just absent-mindedness, but it kept happening, and each time, I felt a prickling sense of familiarity, like a shadow from my past was creeping back into my life. The real turning point came one night when I was up late studying. The apartment was quiet. My parents had long gone to bed. I was at my desk, my back to the door, when I felt it, that strange sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing right behind me. Slowly, I turned around, half expecting to see my mother or father checking in on me. But there was no one there. I let out a sigh, feeling silly, and turned back to my work. But just as I was about to resume studying, I heard it, a faint, shuffling sound coming from the hallway. I froze, my pulse quickening. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, like fabric dragging along the floor. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, Maybe the sound of the building settling or a draft moving something down the hall. But then I heard it again, closer this time, as if whatever was making the noise was inching its way toward my room. My heart raced as I gathered the courage to step out of my room. I had to know what was causing the noise. I crept down the hall, my bare feet silent against the floor. The hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the kitchen light. And there, just past the kitchen doorway, was a shadow, a tall, thin figure, standing motionless. It was her, the same woman I had seen all those years ago. Her hair was still wild, her dress still torn and filthy. But now, in the dim light, I could see her face more clearly. It was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep, sunken eyes that looked impossibly dark, as if they could swallow me whole. We stood there, facing each other in the silence of the night. And then, as if in slow motion, she raised a bony hand and pointed at me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. It was as if she was trying to speak, but the words were lost somewhere between us. I couldn't bear it anymore. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I sat on my bed, my heart racing, as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. This wasn't a dream.
It couldn't be.
She was here in my new home, just as she had been all those years ago. When morning came, the fear felt like a distant memory, a bad dream fading in the daylight. But deep down, I knew it was real. She was back, and I had no idea why. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with finding answers. Who was this woman? Why was she haunting me? Why had she reappeared after all these years? I tried bringing it up with my parents, but they just looked at me like I was losing my mind. It's just stress, my mother said, brushing my concerns aside. You're in high school now. These things happen. People get nightmares when they're stressed.
But I knew it was more than that.
I felt her presence in the apartment constantly, a shadow lurking just out of sight. I'd catch glimpses of her in mirrors, in the darkened corners of rooms, in the reflection of the TV when it was off. It was as if she was everywhere, watching me, waiting for something. Finally, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I spent hours in the library, digging through local records, old newspapers, anything that could give me a clue. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I was desperate to find something, anything, that could explain why this woman was haunting me. After weeks of searching, I stumbled upon an article about a fire that had happened in our old apartment building. It had occurred decades before we moved there. The article mentioned that an elderly woman had died in the fire, trapped inside her apartment because the door was jammed. Her name was Eleanor Crane, a reclusive woman who had no known family or friends. The article included a grainy black and white photo of her. My blood ran cold as I stared at the picture. It was her, the same hollow cheeks, the same wild, tangled hair. Eleanor Crane was the woman who had haunted me as a child, the same woman I was seeing now. But why was she here? And what did she want from me? Armed with the knowledge of Eleanor's story, I returned home, feeling a strange mix of fear and determination. I was convinced that if I could just speak to her, confront her, maybe I could make her go away. Maybe she just needed someone to acknowledge her, to understand her pain. That night, I stayed up, waiting for her. My parents had gone to bed, and the apartment was silent. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the doorway, the very place I'd first seen her all those years ago. Minutes stretched into hours, and just when I began to doubt she would come, I felt a chill fill the room. I looked up, and there she was, standing in the doorway. Her eyes were locked on me, and for the first time, I could see something in them, a glint of recognition, perhaps even relief. But there was something else in her expression, something darker, something that sent a shiver down my spine.
"What do you want?"
I whispered, my voice barely audible. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. Slowly, she raised a hand and pointed toward the wall behind me. I turned to look, my heart pounding, but saw nothing unusual. Just the same dull wallpaper, the same pictures that had always hung there. When I looked back at her, she was gone. But her presence lingered, a cold, suffocating pressure that wrapped around me like a shroud. I realized then that she wasn't here to harm me. She was trying to warn me about what I didn't know. But I could feel it, a sense of impending dread, as if something terrible was coming. The next morning, I noticed a faint outline on the wall where she had pointed. I moved closer and saw it was a crack running from the ceiling down to the floor. I had never noticed it before, but it was there, faint and ominous, as if the wall itself was ready to split open. Was this what she was warning me about? I had no idea, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was only the beginning. The days that followed were filled with an unshakable sense of urgency. The crack in the wall seemed to grow wider each day, a silent testament to the warning the woman had given me. My parents didn't seem to notice it, no matter how many times I tried to point it out. To them, it was as if the crack didn't exist. One night, unable to bear the tension any longer, I decided to confront Eleanor one last time. I stayed up again, waiting for her in the kitchen. The clock ticked past midnight, and just as I began to doubt she would come, a cold breeze filled the room. I turned, and there she was, standing in the doorway. This time, she looked different. Her eyes were filled with something I hadn't seen before, desperation. "Tell me what you want," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why are you here?" She raised her hand and pointed at the crack in the wall, her expression intense. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, I heard her speak for the first time. "They're coming." Her words echoed in my mind, filling me with a bone-deep terror. I wanted to ask her who she meant, but before I could, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and in the pitch black, I felt something brush past me. Something cold, something that made my skin crawl. When the lights came back on, Eleanor was gone. But the crack in the wall had grown wider, and from within its depths, I could see something, an inky blackness that seemed to pulse and breathe, as if it were alive. I realized then that Eleanor hadn't been haunting me. She had been trying to protect me. Whatever lay beyond that wall, she had kept it at bay for years. But now, her strength was fading, and the darkness was breaking through. I don't know what's going to happen next. All I know is that the shadow lurking within that crack feels ancient, hungry, and far more terrifying than Eleanor ever was. And this time, I don't think there's anyone who can save me. The days following Eleanor's last appearance were a haze of dread. The crack in the wall seemed to take on a life of its own, spreading like a web of ink, inching wider and darker each day. I knew I should tell my parents, but every time I opened my mouth, something stopped me, a sense that they wouldn't understand, that they couldn't see the things I was seeing. And then, on the third night after her warning, I woke up to a low, rhythmic sound. At first, I thought it was just the hum of the radiator, but as I lay in bed, I realized it was coming from the wall. It was a slow, steady thump-thump, like the beating of a massive heart. I forced myself to get out of bed, my feet moving almost against my will. The hallway was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of the crack in the wall, glistening with an oily sheen. As I got closer, the sound grew louder, and I could feel a pulsing warmth radiating from the crack. It was like the wall itself was alive. Then I heard something else, a whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rhythmic thumping, but I could make out words in that shadowy murmur. "Soon, they're coming." The voice was Eleanor's, and it sounded weak, drained. I reached out, my hand trembling, brushing my fingertips against the crack. The instant I touched it, a shock went through my body, like an electric current, and the whispering grew louder. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. I could see shadows within the crack, moving, writhing, pressing against the wall as if they were trying to break through. Panicking, I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. And then, in a moment of utter terror, I saw a hand, a long, dark hand with twisted fingers, pushing its way through the crack. The fingers clawed at the edges, widening the crack further, and behind them, a pair of eyes glowed, red and furious, glaring at me through the darkness. I screamed, the sound tearing through the silence of the apartment. My parents came rushing out of their bedroom, flicking on the lights, their faces twisted in confusion and concern. But when I pointed at the wall, when I tried to show them what I was seeing, the crack was gone. The wall was solid, unblemished, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. My parents looked at each other, worry clear in their eyes, and suggested I might be overworked, maybe even suffering from stress-induced hallucinations. They told me to go back to bed, to get some rest. But I knew better. The darkness wasn't gone. It was simply waiting. Sleep became impossible after that. I spent the nights lying awake, staring at the walls, half expecting those twisted fingers and glowing eyes to reappear. The thumping sound continued, only now it was quieter, more intermittent, like a warning drumbeat, an ominous reminder that something was coming. The next night, just as I felt my eyes drooping from exhaustion, I saw her again. Eleanor appeared in the corner of my room, her figure barely visible in the darkness. But this time, she looked weaker, more faded. Her once gaunt face was now almost skeletal, and her eyes seemed to be dimming, as though the strength she had once possessed was slipping away. "Eleanor," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please, tell me what I can do." She stared at me, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she pointed to the wall beside my bed. As I turned to look, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: tiny, intricate symbols etched into the paint, glowing faintly. They looked ancient, otherworldly, and each one seemed to pulse in sync with the beating sound I had been hearing. "Protect," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Protect the boundary." Before I could ask what she meant, Eleanor's form began to dissolve, her figure melting into wisps of smoke, leaving me alone in the dark with nothing but the symbols glowing on the wall. I didn't understand what she was telling me. Protect the boundary?
How?
And from what? Desperate, I spent the next day researching every piece of folklore, every myth about spirits, boundaries, and protective symbols. I didn't go to school, I didn't eat, I just searched. Finally, I found something that seemed to make sense. According to an old story, certain restless spirits could latch onto the living, but only if there was a crack, a weak point, in the world they shared with the afterlife. The boundary, as it was called, was like a thin veil separating the living from the dead. If something had damaged that veil, it could let dark entities bleed through, slipping into our world. But the story offered a glimmer of hope. It claimed that if the boundary could be sealed with a protective mark, the spirits would be forced back, the gateway between worlds would close, and peace would return. Determined, I drew the symbols Eleanor had shown me on sheets of paper and taped them around my room, on every wall, in every corner. I repeated the same symbols on the walls in the hallway, tracing them as best as I could, hoping that whatever ancient power they held would be enough. The final symbol I placed directly on the spot where the crack had appeared. As I pressed the paper against the wall, the thumping sound suddenly stopped. A heavy silence filled the apartment, thick and oppressive. For the first time in days, I felt a strange calm wash over me. That night, as I lay in bed, the apartment was quiet. No thumping, no whispers. It was as if the darkness had finally been pushed back, held at bay by the protective boundary I had drawn. I drifted off to sleep, hoping that it was over, that Eleanor's spirit could finally rest. But in the dead of night, just as sleep claimed me, a whisper echoed in my ear, cold and triumphant. "You cannot keep us out forever." The crack in the wall wasn't gone. It was growing. And this time, I knew it wouldn't be satisfied with staying hidden in the shadows.